All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into beloved Toni Morrison's incredibly powerful book,
Yeah,
and we're doing it using a companion guide.
that's right.
So this is going to be like a shortcut, I guess you could say.
Absolutely, yeah.
For you out there who are trying to get a handle on this book without necessarily reading the whole thing, or maybe you're preparing for an exam or something like that.
Exactly. Maybe you need to catch up,
Right.
Or you've read it and you just want to dive back in and kind of remember some of the finer details.
Yeah. And
This is the place to do it.
for you out there wondering what's in a companion guide, what's so great about these things?
Right.
They have kind of a synopsis of the plot.
Yeah, they lay it all out for you.
They have character analyses.
Absolutely.
They have critical perspectives on the work,
Yeah.
and they even have literary techniques pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
So for you trying to get a sense of this book, why don't we start off with like the basic introduction, like how is this book categorized as a work of literature?
Well, the companion guide points out, it's often categorized as historical fiction
Right.
because it so deeply engages with, the history and impact of slavery.
Of course. Yeah.
But it's also got elements of Gothic horror.
Ooh, spooky.
Yeah, it's very spooky. There's some haunting elements to it.
Okay.
And then also, significantly, it can be viewed as a Bildungsroman, coming-of-age story,
Okay. Interesting.
especially if you look at Denver's journey through the novel.
Yeah, that's interesting for you to think about it, kind of blending all these different genres.
Mm-hmm.
But, at the heart of it all, what's really incredible about Toni Morrison is the way that she gets into the minds of these characters
Yes.
who are, burdened by this really hidden trauma.
Yeah, it's not just the physical brutality.
Right.
She really gets into the psychological landscape of characters.
Right.
We're dealing with the hidden sins of slavery.
Yeah, the unseen scars.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And at the heart of the story, as the companion guide tells us, is this main character, Seath.
Yes, Heath.
And she is a former slave and a mother.
Yes.
And really her story is one of like profound love for her children.
Yeah, and how that's so complicated by the experience of slavery.
Right.
The idea that she was basically treated as a breeder,
Yeah.
a way to create more slaves.
Right.
But she embraces her identity as a protector,
Right. A loving mother.
a loving mother.
Yeah. And so much of what she does in the book stems from this
Right.
idea of going from property to self-defined mother.
Absolutely.
So that brings us to her crime.
Yes.
Which, the book is not a mystery, really.
No, it's not about suspense.
Right. It's about kind of understanding why she does what she does.
Exactly. And enduring it with her,
Right.
coming to terms with it alongside her.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it so compelling for you as a reader,
Mm-hmm.
is that you're kind of on this journey with her to try to figure out, like, what's going on.
Yes.
And how did she get to this point?
And how did she survive it?
Right. And how did she, manage to carry on? Right.
Another thing that's really interesting about the way that the book is written,
Yeah, the narrative approach.
it's not a linear storyline.
No, not at all.
It goes back and forth in time, and there's memories,
Well, flashbacks,
Yeah.
memories, nightmares.
nightmares.
Vivid nightmares.
Yeah, and I think the companion guide compared it to, like Faulkner and Joyce and Woolf,
Yes.
like these very kind of experimental writers.
Very modernist writers.
So for you reading this and thinking, oh my gosh, how do I keep this all straight?
Right. How do I know what's going on?
Like what comes first?
Right.
The companion guide has a great little synopsis.
Yes.
And, it kind of lays out, okay, here's how the story starts.
Right.
We start off with Sith at Sweet Home.
Okay.
And this is a plantation in Kentucky.
Right.
Where she's, living under this relatively kind master. Relatively Garner.
Right.
So you get a sense that, like, okay, it's slavery.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this one kind of
Benevolent figure.
benevolent figure. Yeah.
So while she's there, she gets married to Hallie Suggs.
Right.
And they have 3 kids together.
Yeah. And they try to, build a family life
Right.
under these horrific circumstances.
Yeah.
And then the bottom falls out.
Yeah. Garner dies, and in his place comes school teacher.
The school teacher
Who
represents just, the worst of the worst
Yeah.
of slavery.
Yeah. So that becomes a major turning point in the story.
Absolutely.
And this is where Seath and her children try to escape to Ohio.
Right, to freedom.
Right.
Yeah.
And they manage to find some refuge for just 28 days in Cincinnati.
Right. With Seath's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs.
Yeah, Baby Suggs.
Yeah.
Can you imagine 28 days
Right.
feeling like a lifetime?
Yeah, a lifetime squeezed into just a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the past catches up,
Yes.
and school teacher shows up with his men,
Right.
and Seath decides to do something unthinkable.
Yes. This is where she commits infanticide
Right.
and kills her eldest daughter. And it's all to protect her from being taken aback as a slave.
Exactly. She would rather her daughter be dead than be enslaved.
Yeah. And I mean, it's
Horrific. But
it is horrific, but you have to understand that, like,
yeah,
she's coming from this place of just
sheer terror.
sheer terror. Like, I can't even imagine.
Right.
And so this leads to her imprisonment.
Right. With Denver, the youngest,
Yeah.
the baby.
Yeah. And eventually she's released.
Right through the efforts of the Quaker abolitionist Edward Baldwin
Oh, okay.
and the colored ladies of Delaware, Ohio,
Okay.
helped to secure her release.
Right. But, the trauma doesn't end there.
No, the trauma continues.
Right.
Beloved, the ghost of the murdered child,
Right.
starts to haunt Baby Suggs' house,
Okay.
124 Bluestone Road.
Right. Right. So, years go by.
Years go by.
Seath is now living kind of a solitary life with Denver.
Right.
And her sons have left.
Yeah, they can't take it anymore.
Right.
They can't take the haunting.
They can't take it.
Yeah.
So then comes along Paul D.
Paul D., another survivor from Sweet Home.
Okay, so now we have this kind of interesting relationship.
Yeah, a very layered relationship.
Right, where these two...
They have a shared past.
Right.
A very traumatic shared past.
Yeah, and I guess it's around this time that Beloved also takes on a physical form.
Yes, this is where it gets very intense.
Yeah.
Beloved becomes a young woman.
A real flesh and blood
Flesh and blood.
person. And she develops this very unhealthy and obsessive relationship with Seath.
She's very possessive.
Yeah. And so it's like this manifestation of the past.
Absolutely. It's like the past has come back to life.
Yeah.
To haunt her, literally.
And so it gets to the point where, like, Denver...
Yeah, Denver and the neighbors realize that something's really wrong.
They have to step in.
They do.
And kind of, like, break this up.
Right. Yeah.
And there's this really tragic moment where Seath...
Yes, she mistakes Baldwin for a slave catcher.
Yeah, and she attacks him.
Right.
And then Beloved disappears.
Right.
And then eventually Paul D. comes back.
And offers her a chance to kind of reclaim her life.
Right. And so you see this cycle of trauma, of, this haunting and then this possibility of healing.
Yeah.
And the companion guide does a great job of kind of...
Tracing that.
Yeah, tracing that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the characters. Okay. Because there's some really great insights in here.
Absolutely.
So, like, Seth, we've already talked about her, but, like, what is her primary conflict?
Well, her conflict comes from, this fierce love for her children.
Right.
And her hatred of slavery.
Right.
And that all culminates in this act of infanticide, this horrific decision she makes.
To ensure their freedom.
To ensure their freedom.
Yeah. So it's this really agonizing paradox of love and violence.
Right.
And then you have Beloved.
Beloved.
Who is the murdered daughter.
Yes.
Who comes back first as a ghost and then as a physical being. What's her deal?
Well, her existence is totally wrapped up in Seath's trauma.
Yep.
She haunts Seath. She fixates on her.
Right.
She's constantly demanding her attention.
Right.
And it's like she's this embodiment of this unatoned for loss.
Okay, yeah.
And the pain of slavery.
Yeah.
She's like a walking representation.
Right. She is the past come back to life.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you have Denver.
Denver, the youngest daughter.
The youngest, who is, like, super traumatized.
Of course.
Having witnessed her mother.
Right. And she grows up in isolation.
Right.
And her devotion becomes very fixated on Beloved.
Okay, so they have this weird...
Yeah, it's a very strange family dynamic.
Right. It's created by this shared trauma.
Exactly.
And then you have Paul D. Garner.
Paul D.
Who's another survivor of Sweet Home.
Right.
And he's kind of like a very, like, resourceful guy.
Yeah, he's resourceful. He's contemplative.
Right.
He's very thoughtful.
Yeah, and I guess he represents kind of a potential path.
A potential path towards healing.
Right.
And a future for Sith.
Right.
But he also carries his own scars.
Right.
He's not unscathed.
Right. He's a survivor.
Yeah.
And then there's Hallie Suggs, who's Seath's husband.
Right.
And it's so sad because he works so hard to try to buy his mother's freedom.
Right. And then his escape plan fails.
Yeah.
And you never hear from him again.
Right. And, he also witnessed, or it's implied that he witnessed the assault by the school teacher's nephews.
Right.
And that kind of, like, breaks him.
Yeah, it breaks him psychologically.
Yeah. And then you have Baby Suggs,
Baby
who
Suggs.
is this kind of like stable force.
Yeah, she's a preacher.
Right.
And she, offers spiritual guidance.
Right.
And she's trying to kind of
build community.
build community.
But then she eventually withdraws.
Yeah, when she sees what happens with Seath and Beloved,
Right.
it just becomes too much for her.
Right.
And she withdraws and dies.
Yeah, and then
We can't forget the villain of the story.
Right.
The school teacher.
Who's just like this cruel
Yes, he's just so cruel.
embodiment
Of the worst of slavery.
Yeah.
He sees slaves as commodities, as animals for profit.
Yeah. It's so awful.
It is awful.
And then Stampede,
Who's
a former slave,
Yes.
who helps Seath and Denver
Yeah, he helps him escape.
escape.
And he rescues Denver later on.
Right. And, his own experiences with slavery really inform, like,
His compassion.
his compassion.
And his understanding of Seath.
Right, he gets it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like
A rundown of the main characters.
Yeah, it's helpful to kind of, like, keep all those...
Yeah, they're all very complicated characters.
Right.
And their lives are so intertwined.
Yeah. So the guide also has this really helpful, like...
Chronology.
Yeah.
To help you keep things straight.
Yeah, so it starts off with, like, Seath arriving at Sweet Home as a young girl.
Right.
Then it goes through the births of her children.
Right.
Garner's deaf school teacher's arrival.
Right.
Her harrowing escape, the birth of Denver.
Yes.
With Amy's help.
Right.
And then the 28 days in Cincinnati.
20 days of peace.
Yeah, that brief moment of peace
Yeah.
before it all falls apart.
Right, the attempted recapture.
Right, the infanticide.
The haunting at a 124.
Right. And then
Years later.
Paul D shows up.
Right. 1873.
Right, Beloved's physical reappearance.
Yeah.
Then Paul D leaves when he learns the truth.
Right.
And then the community intervenes.
Right.
Beloved disappears.
Yes.
And then Paul D comes back to Seath.
Yeah, so it's this whole arc of enduring trauma confrontation.
Right. And then the possibility of healing.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's also some great, like, chapter by chapter analysis.
Absolutely.
So why don't we get into some of those details?
Okay.
So chapter 1, like, right off the bat.
Yeah, throws you right into it.
You get this haunted house.
Yeah, 124 Bluestone Road. You get the tension between Seath and Denver.
Right.
And then the disruption of Paul D arriving.
Right.
It's like throwing a bomb into the situation.
Yeah.
And right away you get these details
Right.
that are so specific to the time period.
Right.
Like slop jars and the way that Dearly Beloved
Right.
was used in funerals.
Yeah, and it has a glossary.
It does.
So for you reading this and thinking, like, what is a slop jar?
Right.
Like, you can look it up.
It explains it right there.
Yeah. And then you get these little details, like Seath's method for testing the temperature of the stove.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting to think about, like,
Yeah, her practical knowledge.
yeah, the practical knowledge
Yeah.
of that time.
Yeah.
And the fact that she's, pregnant and lactating simultaneously, which is like,
A sign of her resilience.
yeah, like what her body has been through.
Right.
Yeah. Chapter 2.
Okay, chapter 2. You have this encounter between Seath and Paul D.
Right, a sexual encounter. But it's very unsatisfying.
Yeah, it's not romantic.
Right.
It's kind of just like
Yeah.
a release of tension.
Yeah.
But it brings up these memories of slavery.
Right, so it's very loaded.
Yes, very loaded.
And I think the companion guide does a good job of contrasting, like,
Right.
The limited time that Seath and Hallie had for intimacy
Right, because they were working all the time.
versus, like, Sixo.
Right, who would travel miles to see his lover Patsy.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's this extended metaphor of the cornfield.
Yes.
Which is so interesting because it's like...
Well, it's connected to female genitalia.
Right.
And it's this image of, life and fertility.
Right.
But it's also...
But also, like...
Yeah, it's also a place of, back-breaking labor.
Right, of violence.
Yeah.
And then chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
Denver is seeking refuge in the boxwood shrubs.
Yes.
And it's kind of like...
The symbol of her loneliness.
Right, like she's hiding.
Yeah, she's hiding from the world.
Yeah, and it's like this kind of like little Eden.
Yes, a little Eden.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's this continuing motif of genital imagery
Okay.
with Denver's birth in a canoe.
Right.
That's described as vaginal shaped.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very symbolic.
Yeah.
And there's another sign of Seath's devotion to her children.
Right, like this is how I brought you into the world.
Right.
Yeah. And you also see the contrasting ways that
Wow.
Seath and Paul D deal with their past.
Yes.
Like Seath tends to be silent
Wait.
and Paul D sings.
Yes, he sings away his pain.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then chapter 4.
Yeah. Captive audience.
You have this carnival scene,
Yes, the cards
which seems like a moment of joy,
Right.
but there's also this violence underneath.
Yeah, there's like these images of savagery.
Right.
And it foreshadows the darker events to come.
Right. And then also the term pickaninnies is used,
Right.
which is obviously a racial slur.
Yes, a very derogatory term.
Yeah. So then in chapter 5,
Chapter 5,
Beloved appears.
Beloved arrives.
Yeah. And it's so strange that Seath doesn't immediately recognize her.
Yeah, you think she would,
Right.
but she doesn't.
Yeah. And the dog, Here Boy Leaves,
Right.
which is like a classic, like,
Yeah, like a ghost dog.
ghost dog. Yeah.
Yeah, dog knows.
Yeah. And then chapter 6,
Chapter 6.
Beloved wants to hear all these stories
Yes.
about Seath's past.
Right. She wants to know about her mother, who
Right.
she calls ma'am,
Right.
and about the diamonds,
The diamonds.
the crystal earrings.
Yeah. And so this is where we learn about Seath's mother's branding
Right.
and her death.
Yes.
And the concept of rememory is introduced, which is like,
This involuntary recall of traumatic memories,
right.
it just comes flooding back.
Yeah. And then chapter 7,
Chapter 7.
Beloved kind of gives this cryptic clue.
Yeah, she says she was at the bridge.
Right.
But we don't know what that means.
Yeah. And Paul D tells Seath that Hallie witnessed the assault.
Yes, and that he had mental breakdown because of it.
Yeah. And we also learn about Paul D's own humiliation.
Right, the iron bit and
Right.
Rooster Mister.
And that the house was a way station on
Right.
the Underground Railroad.
Right, it's got all this history.
Yeah. And then chapter 8,
Chapter 8.
we see this kind of bond between Denver and Beloved.
Right, like a sisterly bond.
Yeah. And Denver tells Beloved the story of her birth
Right,
and Amy Denver's role in that.
right.
And the guide highlights this idea that Denver has this longing to cancel an old debt,
Yeah.
which is interesting to think about.
It's like she feels responsible
Right.
for her mother's past.
Yeah. And then there's this contrast between Amy.
Right, Amy, who's so focused on material things,
Right.
and Seath, who's just trying to survive.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And then you have these images of the 4 summer stars
Right.
and the pathetic fallacy
Yes.
of Denver's birth.
Yeah, it's very poetic.
Yeah. So then chapter 9,
Chapter 9.
Seath feels like she's being strangled.
Right, and she thinks it's jealousy.
Okay.
But we don't know for sure.
Yeah.
And Denver becomes even more isolated
Okay.
after Nelson Lord reveals the truth about Seath's past.
Right.
And she withdraws from school, and that's when you first hear the baby ghost.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so things are getting creepy.
Yeah. And then the guide reminds us of Baby Suggs' teachings
Right.
and the spiritual don't study war no more,
Yes.
which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, it's like a message of hope
Right.
in the midst of all this darkness.
Yeah. And then chapter 10,
Chapter 10.
Paul D, you get this backstory on him.
Yeah, his experiences as a slave
Right.
and in prison
Right.
and his escape.
And his escape, which the guide compares to like Odysseus and Aeneas.
Right, these epic heroes
Yeah.
who go on these long journeys.
Yeah. And he meets some Native Americans.
Yes.
And there's this kind of like moment of respite there.
Right.
And then he has his tobacco tin,
Yeah.
which is like,
A symbol of his hardened heart.
right.
He keeps his feelings locked away.
Yeah. And then chapter 11,
Chapter 11.
Paul D distances himself from Seath.
Right. He starts sleeping in the cold house.
Right.
And Beloved comes to him
Yeah.
and forces herself on him.
Right.
And you see this like power that she has.
Right.
And the guide mentions the biblical allusion to Lot's wife.
Right. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
And then chapter 12,
Chapter 12.
the mystery of Beloved deepens.
Yes.
And Seath thinks that Beloved was abused,
Right.
but Denver thinks she's the ghost.
Right.
And then there's the scene in the cold house
Right.
where it's suggested that Beloved is like,
Yeah, she's not just Seath's child.
right.
She's like all the nameless slaves.
right.
She's the embodiment of the past.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
Yeah. And then chapter 13 and 14,
13 and 14.
we get Paul D's reflections on manhood
Right. How is different at Sweet Home?
versus under school teacher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he remembered his Sixo's death. And then he proposes to Seath.
Right.
But then Beloved shows up
Yes, she always shows up.
and kind of ruins the moment.
Yeah.
Chapter 16.
Chapter 16.
This is a big one.
It is a big one.
It's the flashback to the arrival of school teacher.
Right.
And Seath's infanticide.
Yes.
And you see school teachers dehumanizing views.
Right. He thinks they're savages.
Right.
That too much freedom has made them savage.
Yeah. And Stampede tries to take the baby's body.
Right.
And rescue Denver.
Yeah.
And there's this image of Seath holding Denver to her bloodstained nipple.
Right.
Which is like
so powerful.
So intense.
So visceral.
Yeah. And the onlookers are humming.
Yes.
Which is like
very eerie.
Eerie, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's this image of the bracken and the blackberries.
Right. The prickly bracken yielding sweet blackberries.
Yeah, which is like
a symbol of how pain can lead to something good.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. And then the four horsemen show up.
Right.
Like the apocalypse.
Yeah, it's very apocalyptic.
Yeah. Chapter 17.
Chapter 17.
Stampede finds the newspaper clipping about Seth's infanticide.
Yeah.
And Paul D is like, no way, I don't believe it.
Right. He's in denial.
Yeah. And then Seth recounts her memories.
Right.
And her fears.
Yeah.
And Paul D realizes what she did.
Right.
And he leaves.
Yeah, he can't handle it.
Yeah. And he says that really harsh thing.
Yeah.
You got 2 feet, Seth, not 4.
Yeah.
Which is like
brutal.
Brutal.
Yeah.
And then chapter 18.
Chapter 18.
Seth is completely isolated.
Right, everyone rejects her.
The community rejects her.
Yeah.
Baby Suggs withdraws.
Yeah, she just gives up.
Yeah.
And dies.
And Stampede feels guilty.
Yeah, he understands why the community is reacting the way they are.
Right.
Even if he doesn't agree with it.
Right.
He gets it.
Yeah. And then chapter 19.
Chapter 19.
Paul D is at the church.
Yeah, seeking refuge.
Yeah, and Stampede reads him the article. And then there's this reference to the dead Miami.
Right.
Which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, like another example of loss and displacement.
Yeah, chapter 20 and 21.
20 and 21.
You see Seath's determination to like reclaim Beloved.
Right.
And her memories of Sweet Home.
Yes.
And Denver is afraid.
Right.
And isolated.
Yes.
And she clings to Beloved.
Yeah, she's very possessive of Beloved.
Yeah. And then chapters 22 and 23.
So 22 and 23.
They all kind of merge together.
Yeah, Seath, Beloved, and Denver.
Right.
They become this like single entity.
Yeah, and they're all saying, you are mine.
Yes.
Which is like
very possessive
and
disturbing.
Yeah. And Denver realizes that Beloved might be harmful.
Right, she's starting to see the danger.
Yeah.
And her memories of her brothers fade.
Right.
It's like Beloved is consuming her.
Yeah. Chapter 24.
Chapter 24.
Paul D is outside the church.
Right, he's thinking about Sweet Home and Sixo's death.
Right.
And he realizes that Seath was more valuable as a breeder.
Right.
And he feels humiliated.
Yeah, and he wishes he had joined Sixo's song.